Stevens Public Finance presents Capital Thinking, a national perspective on funding K-12 education capital projects. This conversation features the perspectives of leaders in education from Arkansas, Texas, and Tennessee, along with Stevens Public Finance professionals, on hurdles related to school funding and completing projects on time, the impact of COVID-19 and remote learning on infrastructure needs, and how complications such as natural disasters and politics can impact public finance for K-12 education. Stevens Public Finance experts, Leigh Biernat, CPA and Senior Vice President, and Alfred Ray, Vice President, are joined by David Woolley, Superintendent of Alma School District in Arkansas, and former Vice Chairman of the Board of Directors of the Arkansas Public School Computer Network, Johnny Hill, Chief Financial Officer at the Allen Independent School District in Texas and a certified public accountant, and Dr. Donna Wright, the Wilson County Director of Schools in Tennessee.
Hello, I am Leigh Biernat, a CPA and Senior Vice President in the Public Finance team at Stevens Incorporated. Welcome to Capital Thinking, Public Finance Insights for Today's Market. This virtual thought leadership webinar series explores the challenges and opportunities affecting capital projects for state, municipal, and county government transactions. Stevens has a long history serving this space. The firm was established in 1933 to trade Arkansas highway bonds and has since become a leader in public finance across the southern United States. We have deep expertise in creating solutions for government structures, utilities, healthcare, housing, transportation, sales and use tax, and of course, education. Our dedicated public finance team, which now consists of 21 professionals, completed over 275 transactions in 2020. This ranged from helping issuers with construction and refunding bonds to general obligation and revenue bonds. My co-host today is Alfred Ray. Alfred has a PhD in education administration and spent 30 years in public education in Texas before joining our firm last July. Alfred, welcome.
Well, thank you, Leanne. I appreciate it. For this webinar, we'll be looking at a national perspective on funding K-12 education capital projects. And in terms of topics we'll talk about covering the hurdles of attaining the desired level of funding and completing projects on timeline, how the COVID-19 pandemic and the remote learning is affecting infrastructure decisions, and how other complications such as natural disasters and politics can impact public finance for K-12 education. Our discussion will dive into the current public finance landscape and education transactions in Arkansas, Texas, and in Tennessee. And we will address themes that are common to all of these states, as well as the national scene, and then specific to each individual district or municipality where our guest panelists lie. As a matter of fact, this is a perfect time to introduce our guest panelists. Leanne?
Certainly, Alfred. Our three panelists are highly informed experts on these subjects, and I think we're going to have a great discussion today. With us today are David Woolley, Superintendent of the Alma School District in Arkansas, and the former Vice Chair of the Board of Directors of the Arkansas Public School Computer Network. David, welcome.
Thanks, Leanne. It's a pleasure to be invited to do this. I know we're going to have a great time.
We also have Johnny Hill, Chief Financial Officer at the Allen Independent School District in Texas and a certified public accountant. Hello, Johnny.
Thanks, Leanne. Once again, just as Dr. Woolley said, it's very, very good to be with you this morning and very honored to be a part of this panelist.
And last but certainly not least, we have Dr. Donna Wright, the Wilson County Director of Schools in Tennessee. Hello, Donna.
Hello, Leanne, and thank you. I really look forward to this discussion and hope to learn a lot from my colleagues as well.
Well, we appreciate you all participating today. The Alma School District is located in northwestern Arkansas, has 4 schools with a student population of approximately 3,250 children and a staff of over 415 professionals. The Allen Independent School District is just north of the Dallas metro area, and it has 23 schools. The student population is 21,500 children, with 1,800 professionals and 350 paraprofessionals. And we have the Wilson County School System, which is located approximately 20 miles east of Nashville, has 23 schools with a student population of approximately 18,685 children and a staff of over 1,400 professionals. I'm sure everyone is excited to hear what our panelists have to say. Alfred, the floor is yours. Please get us started.
Well, thanks again, Leanne. I'd be happy to. So let's begin by addressing the one topic that's been affecting us for the past year, the pandemic. One of the great challenges regarding COVID-19 is we have a situation where we have many societal adjustments that have been happening over the course of the last year. And we have to deal with how many of those adjustments are temporary, how much of it represent permanent behavioral changes, and how much of it is yet to be determined. So hopefully our panelists will share a variety of perspectives on this topic. And with that in mind, I'm going to begin with my colleague in Texas, Johnny Hill, and start with this question. How has the pandemic and the remote learning it's triggered for so many of our students affected your district's K-12 infrastructure decisions? Particularly, how does that affect building ventilation, instructional space layout, personal protective equipment necessities, student access to technology? But Johnny, please feel free to address any other relevant decisions you have as well.
Thank you, Dr. Ray. I appreciate the question. Obviously, we were about to go on spring break a year ago this last March, and I was already in the car with my family, headed to my in-laws, and I got a call, received a call from my superintendent, and she said, "I'm sorry, you need to come back to the office. We are shutting down schools. Everything's going to look completely different for the rest of this school year." So I turned my car around. We went back. We spent a week just trying to, what can we do at this point to actually get kids and continue to educate kids. And a lot of those had to do with infrastructure, with facilities. And so what we did is, in Texas anyway, we obviously shut down and we went 100% remote for the remainder of this last year. We were very, very fortunate in the fact that we were already going on a one-to-one with our technology devices for our students and with our staff. So we were very fortunate that we had the technology already in place, that we were able to pivot rather quickly. Obviously, we didn't do an excellent job, but I feel like we did an adequate job of continuing to educate kids through the remainder of the spring semester of last year. And then obviously throughout the summer, of course, we had to take a look about facilities in particular, because in Texas, we actually, our governor came out and gave all the students an opportunity to go in school learning or virtual learning. Every family had an opportunity to choose the way they were going to do that. In our school district, starting in the fall of the 2020 school year, we actually had about 70% that chose to come in person. And obviously that was still quite a bit, especially with the CDC social distancing norms, the guidelines that they were putting out. So we had to go through, we spent quite a bit of money, just to be honest with you, millions of dollars to go through, rework our ventilation system, try to put air throughout the buildings, as well as upgraded all of our, our MERV rated filtration filters. And then we also basically had to rewrite, do a bunch of signage as far as the way kids, how they were in the common areas, the way they, we basically went backwards, because we were in the process of doing a more collaborative approach to education, where you did education out in the hallways, you had these common areas, and we went completely back to old school, is, trying to cohort some of these students on how they actually interacted, how they actually went through the day. And so we actually spent several $1 million as far as personal protection equipment, as far as just like I said, the ventilation systems with signage. It was a pretty big undertaking, and it's been I will say, this is my 27th year in school business. This has been a very, very challenging year for everyone.
Well, thank you, Johnny. I know it's been a very challenging year for everyone. It's also a tribute to educators, educational leaders, to the teachers and campus-based staff, and especially those great maintenance people, the custodial people, the healthcare people that work in the school district to make that pivot so quickly. So it's a tribute to you. Do any of our other esteemed panelists have something they'd like to add to that particular thought?
Well, just quickly, I suspect many, if not most, school administrators across the country would echo this same thing. Our experience mirrors what happened in Allen, Texas, just right down the list. All of the things you just mentioned, we did too.
I think I'll come to you with my next thought, my next question. How have your districts made capital infrastructure investment or plans for investments to support the educational response to coronavirus? So specifically, any plans you may have, bond dollars, bond types, even if they're still in the proposal phases, how have y'all made those types of decisions?
Well, interestingly, when last March, when all of us learned to spell a new word, coronavirus, we were right in the middle of planning for a refunding, restructuring, and with a generation of some additional funds for a small construction project. So we stopped where we were last March to reconsider what do we need to do different, knowing what we think we're facing for the next year. And we went ahead with our project, took it to the voters in November, and they approved it. But we did make some changes in what our construction was going to be. We programmed some dollars that we didn't have otherwise for HVAC work, as Johnny talked about. And it gave us the opportunity, since we were going into this anyway, it gave us the chance to shift some dollars in our plans to be sure we were doing everything that we needed to do. Now, of course, we all had the CARES Act money, the ESSER funds to address many things, but we couldn't get to everything with those dollars. And it was a wonderful opportunity for us, which was very much happenstance that we were already planning a restructuring that we could do this. The restructuring in and of itself generated quite a bit of annual cash because of lowering our payment. So it was the opportunity to get some things done that otherwise I'm not sure how we would have done.
Great. Another great example of making that pivot. Do any of our other panelists have something they'd like to add to what David has just told us?
We're in a different situation in Tennessee and specifically in Wilson County because prior to the pandemic, we had a devastating tornado that ripped through Middle Tennessee, and we lost 2 of our schools, a middle school and an elementary school, essentially displacing 1,700 students and 150 staff members. So that, and then 2 weeks later, the pandemic hits us. And so with that, we really didn't have the time to really make many decisions that I'm envious of Dr. Woolley and Mr. Hill's ability as far as to place those plans out there. However, it's one of those things that no one could have planned or had contingencies for what was going to occur, no matter the situation, particularly with a pandemic. But it also gave us an opportunity to really dig in deep as far as what were the things that we needed to do in order that we weren't going to have that loss of instruction. What we're going to do to replace 2 buildings. How are we going to, take 1,700 kids and place them in a existing buildings on top of everyone else? And so with that, we've been fortunate being able to make those occur, but also something that's not been touched on. I know that both had talked about a one-to-one plan, and many of us had initially that too. But one of the things that when you look at just how that's been structured and how we've worked in times past, it wasn't in anticipation that it would be used long-term and almost as a replacement for as far as in-person instruction. And so what I would add to this is that looking at how to finance not only the technology, but which would be needed on a one-to-one basis, but also the infrastructure, the support that you would need it to keep it sustained. And something that we all faced, and this was something that became a national issue, the inability to support high-speed broadband that was equitable to all. We found that 30% of our families, not because of their economic disposition, but because they didn't have access, but 30% of our families did not have access to high-speed which became another funding, but also making a public awareness. So there were a lot of casualties, if I might, that allowed us to learn how we needed to restructure, how we need to look at how we would fund it. This was something that, talking to colleagues around the country, was something that they had to dig deep because there was no plan for this and how to address it.
Well, thank you. That is an important thought, Dr. Wright. That is very important because, as you know, so many of the things that have occurred in the past year may impact us on a long-term basis in ways that we had not planned. Your discussion about the tornadoes is very relevant to my next question, which I'll direct to Johnny Hill. Obviously, the COVID-19 is a type of disaster, but especially in Texas, such a large state. But your school districts have faced many different types of disasters. How do you deal with construction or reconstruction, depending on the case, after those disasters? Like Texas, we've dealt with droughts, we've had blizzards, floods, wildfires, hurricanes, tornadoes. How do those disasters impact, I should say, public financing decisions, particularly for departments like athletics, technology, or maintenance?
I think it's a great question, Dr. Ray. And of course, here, I mean, you live here, so you understand this, but we were blessed to have Winter Storm Uri come through, and just to compare it with what these hurricanes, we're normally down on the coast. We actually have to deal with, our counties down on the coast have to deal with hurricanes on an annual basis. Hurricane Harvey, of course, came through just a couple of years ago. It actually affected about 60 counties. In Texas, there's 254 counties. Winter Storm Uri actually affected 254. Every county was affected by this, which is unusual even for the state of Texas because it is a large landmass. But obviously, with the Winter Storm Uri coming in, it shut everything down. It's the first time in 30 years that we actually shut everything down for over almost 10 days. And as a result of that, we had to go back and rethink. We had just passed a bond back in November. And so we started rethinking, just like Dr. Woolley said, we started rethinking, okay, what can we do with these bond monies to be more proactive with these disasters that do come through? And so we started looking at redundancies with our technology. When we do go down, even though we are, there's more and more, that is being done, through technology, whenever one thing hits, all of a sudden it shuts, nobody can do anything. It basically is it basically keeps you from doing anything you need to do. And so we started looking, okay, how can we do more redundancies in our technology? How can we get the infrastructure out to all parts of our school district? And then also just with the facilities themselves, we actually started thinking about, okay, backup systems. Do we need to start placing generators in certain strategic areas to, because we can't afford to lose all of this data that we've accumulated if for something we have one of these natural disasters happen again. And so we started looking at facility wise, it was more technology related. But I do know, as far as you've heard about the power grid completely cratering in Texas as well. And so we're in the middle of a legislative session. We're blessed to have one of those once every 2 years. So several months, but everything that was happening in the state legislatively all of a sudden took a sharp left turn right after the winter storm Uri hit. And our governor and our leadership in our state said, oh my goodness, we have to actually have legislation to start mandating some of these changes. And so, there's about 7,600 bills that have been introduced over the last couple of months. And there are literally, almost 1,000 of those bills now have to do with what Dr. Wright was talking about, which as far as getting, internet service throughout the entire state, number one. And then number two is making sure that we don't crater our grid again, like we did through this storm.
Well, thank you. Again, it's a very big tribute to all of you guys for the hard work you did in making that pivot. And I'll direct my next thought to Dr. Donna Wright in Tennessee. Dr. Wright, to what extent do the various department heads individually have a say in how your school district raises capital or uses public financing in the wake of a disaster? Like, is it a matter of which department needs the most help to repair damage, or which department can make the most progress, or is it some other strategic consideration?
Alfred, I'll have to go to some other strategic consideration because in Tennessee, we are funded a little differently than my colleagues in Arkansas and Texas. our school district and any school district in the state of Tennessee does not have the ability to raise funds. They do not have taxing authority. They cannot go out independently as far as bonds. When I look at the language that are used in other states, such as millage, that is a foreign term in Tennessee. And so we are dependent on a funding body. And in my case, in Wilson County, it's our county commission. And so whatever need beyond the budget, emergency needs, or everything, that's something that I must take to our county commissioners for either assistance, help, particularly building my case of why and how to get there. So it's very unique in Tennessee in that case. However, the situation that we faced, particularly last spring, the loss of the 2 schools, that was something that, again, we never could have anticipated that a pandemic would be quickly following. And then how would that work to replace 2 schools? And I have to say right now, we are a year out and I am still waiting and negotiating with insurance to get those 2 buildings rebuilt. So with that, there's a lot of not only the negotiations, but also stating our case, because the other thing, Alfred, that we have to work with is that public perception. I have 2 buildings that are in rubble on the other side of town, and the idea that why are we not doing anything? And it's not because of our funding body. However, the process is far different because you have to exhaust those first buckets of dollars and moving forward there. And so again, it's very unique here. It's very complex in a very different kind of way. But the thing is that once we get past the building, then it's going to make sure that we build capacity. We're the 2nd fastest growing school district in the state of Tennessee, in spite of the loss of schools, in spite of the pandemic. And so the ability to be proactive and looking at that projected growth, the funding body, again, will be very critical as far as working with us in that nature. So that's one of the things that we have to build our case there. And we're right into what I call the delicate dance of the budget, which will be moving in the next 2 months. I see John is smiling there, so he knows exactly what I'm talking about. So it's a little different from what my colleagues work through, but again, everyone has a part in it. I'll have to say that there's been a lot of, not only at the local level, but also at the state level, because what also happens with our funding formula in the state of Tennessee is what the state's funds, and particularly for public education in the state, but also that local ability to pay. We are also the 2nd wealthiest county in the state of Tennessee per capita. So our ability to pay leverages against what we will see as that state funding formula. So a little different, but again, working through all that, and a lot of good people trying to support us in that effort.
Great. Thank you, Donna. That was a very insightful perspective. I'm going to turn over to Leigh as we talk about some different types of challenges we have in a K-12 education funding.
Thank you, Alfred. That was a good discussion. Now let's move on to funding hurdles. In general, what are the main obstacles to raising the desired level of public financing for capital projects in your school district? And David, I'll start with you. How has your district overcome them in the past?
Well, let me start. Instead of using the word obstacles, let's use the word considerations.
That's fair.
I think these are certainly things to consider, but hopefully we avoid them being obstacles. And I will name 3. 2 of them are, although very important, not hard to master. One would be having a fiscal agent that serves your needs, that does what you need done and does it effectively. Put in a plug for Stevens here. We've been using Stevens for 50-something years for all of our bond issue needs. And that's very important. That longevity with the same company, they know us, they know how we think, they know what is important to us, and we know what to expect out of them. A second one I would name is knowing what your needs are, doing a good job of analyzing yourself, your own district. What is it you need bond money for? It's easy to say, well, if I had $50 million, I'd do this. Well, you got to be sure that the decision of what you can't start with the dollars, you got to start with the need. But then the third thing I will mention is by far the most important, and that is your relationship with your voters. Nothing else matters if the voters don't say yes. So we approach that from the perspective of it's not what we say to them and do for or to them the months leading up to a vote. It's what we do with them and the relationship we have with them every day, all the time. In my experience, the districts that are unsuccessful with millage campaigns and bond issues, that's their shortcoming, is that they don't have a good rapport with their community on a daily basis, whether that's a trust issue or something that sometimes it's out of the district's control that gets the community looking at things in a different way. But that has to be job one. That has to be something that a district concentrates on every day. And that's a lot of things. That's everything from, are the shrubs trimmed, to is your academic success of your students where the community expects it to be. It's not just one or two things, it's everything. And if you take care of those things, when you get ready to go to the community and say, here's what we need, here's why we need it, and they have the attitude that, well, everything else they've done, it looks like they've done right, we'll believe them and go with them on that, then you have success.
I would add, because again, David said it so well, you have to build your story. You can't go, and I like the idea as far as looking at those considerations, informing the public, updating them, making sure that not only are you providing as far as what I call a factual map, but also the visuals that people can see and understand. We've been very fortunate, particularly I go back to our funding body, but also our public, because we've been very ambitious with building projects in Wilson County and in providing as far as that story. We've built 3 schools in the last 3 years, renovated, and I say renovate, extensive renovations of older existing buildings, 6 or 7 of those, but also putting forward, looking and projecting forward with our growth of not only what we're going to need and why we're going to need it. And it's really been not only of a benefit, but it goes back to what David said too. It's building that trust. It's not asking for what you would like to have, but looking at and really showing the need, but also being able to, as people look back to what we've already, said that we needed and what we have, stayed good to our word, showing, and it turns out to be a real strong return on investment, because it's not the sky's falling. Here are the facts. Based on this, here are the projections, and then looking and being able to work forward. And right now, looking next 3 to 5 years, we're already looking at 2 schools and possibly a 3rd one in the next 5 years. So again, David said it so well, you've got to put the why out there before you get to the how.
Perfect. Thank you, Dr. Wright. So now let's talk about, you hear about projects being on time and on budget. So once you achieve proper funding, it makes, that makes it theoretically possible to complete K through 12 projects according to their original deadline. But as we all know and have experienced, factors other than funding can get in the way of even the most reasonable deadlines. So Dr. Wright, I'd like to ask you, what are the most typical causes of project delays in your district? And how have they resulted in cost overruns relative to the original projected cost? And how has your district handled those discrepancies?
Well, I'll have to back up a little bit because I have a perfect example. And again, I relate to the fact that we built 3 schools in the last 3 years: an elementary 3 years ago, a middle school 2 years ago, and opened a brand new comprehensive, our 5th high school, last year. And at the time, there was a lot of consternation because of just the size and the projected costs of 435,000 square foot comprehensive high school, and something that was being presented over and over as far as one of the most expensive public capital projects in the state, particularly looking at school construction. The other thing that we were up against, we're right outside Nashville, which is developing quickly. That is a destination point from all over the country, well, really internationally. And anytime that you can look and see 12 to 14 cranes in the air in downtown Nashville, you can imagine what kind of impact on construction costs would have with any of the surrounding metro area. And so we were up against that, looking at the cost, looking at being able to deliver in 2 years and trying to meet that. And not knowing that we were also going to have a place for additional students. So with that, we completed a 435,000 square foot project exactly in 24 months, in spite of 130 weather-related rain days that would slow it down. And so with that, there's this idea of incentivizing because the need became so great. And I'll have to say that we came under what was the projected cost, but it was close. But the thing is that with it was working constantly, staying on top of it, working with your contractors, working to make sure that there was no what you call change orders, which anyone that's been in school construction, you know that can not only be costly, but things that were never even anticipated. So looking at that way, it was building into your contracts as far as to incentivize and to bring it in on time, but also to make sure that when you're working with your contractors, when you're looking with even your architects, that you anticipate from past projects so that you don't get into those overcharges, change orders, overruns, and again, and it's really served us well. How do you incentivize as far as bringing in on time and on budget? Because it's a whole lot better when you have to go back, and if you've never experienced that you've under budgeted and had to go back for additional funds for any capital project. You don't want to do that.
Well, Dr. Wright, let me ask you, have you had instances where you have actually come in under budget and you've been able to make arrangements for those excess funds?
Well, and that's something that we've been fortunate, and not only in this district, but in another district that I was in previous years. And every school district has what I call projects that are on the docket. You know, if you had the funds, you would get to this, whether it's a renovation, whatever it might be, roofing projects. And so when we have, where we come under budget, we look at those projects that are on the docket that would be the next thing and make sure that that's addressed, but also making sure that, again, our funding body, the public, knows that how those dollars are being used, but it's one less opportunity that we have to go to our taxpayers and say, we're going to need additional funds. And we've been very fortunate that we've been able to take those next projects and everything from athletic facilities to looking at air units, ventilation prior to the pandemic. And so again, those dollars are used, but also you have to have that cushion in there, because with any new construction, and I know my colleagues know this very well, there are always some things that were not either anticipated or need to be considered. And again, we've been fortunate that we've been able to use those funds on other projects, and one less time to have to go before our county commission asking for additional dollars.
Thank you, Dr. Wright. Yes, and talking about going to the voters, David, I'd like to talk with you about your experience with millage election campaigns to fund educational capital projects. What tips or strategies do you recommend for those pursuing a millage election for their district?
Well, let me talk first about a fairly unusual one that we just did. The millage campaign that I was referencing a moment ago that we did last year during 2020 was voted on in November and approved. We were in a pretty unique situation. We had not sold any original bonds in 20 years. So our total debt, or our outlying debt schedule, was getting short. We were down to only about 15 years of debt in front of us. So we had some headroom, had a lot of headroom when we went into this refinancing. So we stretched our millage out. We generated some cash for some construction. But the unique thing we did was we lowered our millage. We put in Arkansas, even to lower your millage, the voters have to approve that. So we put that on the ballot to lower our millage. Well, we had two reactions. One, that's a misprint. Or two, what's the game here? But of course, we were prepared for both of those and addressed them. And when people really came to realize we could do that financially, everything worked for us to accomplish our goals financially. And when people realized that we were willing to lower their tax rate and give something back that they had given us some years ago, it passed big. I would recommend that anytime you could do it. But, I really did feel, as I said over and over and over during the campaign, if we can accomplish what we need to do and can lower our millage in the process, why wouldn't we? Because it's the right thing to do for the citizens. So that's a little bit of an unusual occurrence that we had, but it was really kind of neat to see it on roll. But typically, you've got to go into an election, a millage election, leaving no stone unturned. You can't take it for granted. We did once. We took one for granted. We were wanting to do some safety upgrades, student safety upgrades, shortly after Sandy Hook in Connecticut 10 years ago. And, we were a little complacent in thinking, who's going to vote against student safety right now? Well, that was a mistake. We still had to make our case. We could not rely on people to read the news and know, well, of course I'm going to vote for student safety. So that was a very valuable lesson to us, that you cannot assume those things. You have to address them. You have to be sure that your voting public knows everything they could possibly, they have to know, you have to tell them more than they really want to hear. And you have to tell it to them multiple times. And if you do that, then almost always you're going to come out okay.
Thank you, David. Well, when recommending the school tax rate for your district to adopt, Johnny, how do you balance the responsibility to the local taxpayer versus the needs of the district?
I think Dr. Woolley and Dr. Wright both hit on this, and that is communicate. And so we bring in, we're a fast growth school district. We bring in demographers we work with, we do assessments. We work very, very closely with our chief appraisers. And then we'll do a 5-year budget, a rolling 5-year budget model. So we factor in everything. Whenever we look at that year, when we present, we'll communicate to the public, we'll communicate to our board of trustees, and we roll and factor all of those into the current year, but also what's coming down the road. What are some hurdles that we're going to have to overcome coming down the road? And so we feel like when we factor in, like I said, the demographer, the student enrollment that we're dealing with, and then also even our long range facility plan into our 5-year budget model. Once we factor all that in, we start communicating that out. We get buy-in. Dr. Woolley, he said it perfectly. I mean, you've got to build goodwill. You've got to have a trust factor there. And when you do, then your community will come along beside you. They want to support your school systems. They really want to be there for the students of your community. And so we want to make them feel good. We want to make sure that they feel invested in what we're trying to accomplish. So I think that we've had really good success with doing that. But it's more than just, hey, we need to raise the taxes because we have the budget we've got to balance. There's a lot more to the story than that. So you've got to tell your story, and then you've got to have buy-in on that story.
And again, our situation in Tennessee is a little different, but again, it goes back to that story and something that I've found in nearly 40 years in being education, that when you talk to the public, when you talk to your school families, what they know is in their world, where their children go to school, where they have reside for a large portion of their time of raising children. But when you start projecting and showing them not only the size of the district, but start showing them where, and we create hotspots. I was happy to hear Johnny talk about the demographers bringing in, because that creates a visual and a story as well, that it's not just your community, but looking at the expanse of a district and why, it goes back to the why again, the need not only for buildings, but being able to project, because the other thing that we also have to do as school districts is build up a land inventory. Where will that be? And again, I'm sure that's happening in Texas and Arkansas as well. People are buying up property And so schools are getting strangled school districts are being strangled as far as the inability to find enough acreage to build and construct. And so that goes back to that story again, showing that picture of the entire district, not just a community school. And it's something that's interesting looking at the dynamics. There's a lot of research behind this, that when people see that it's beyond just where their children attending, but the benefit to all, and looking and being able to project, they're much quicker to support whatever is needed with that tax increase to build that construction, because you've built that for them, built the capacity. We all benefit. And that's something I've certainly learned in a period of time, that we have to take them outside their community where they're safe, because their school is always the best school. Might not be the same with the rest of the district, but their school's the best. And you can ask any family and they will tell you that.
That's a very good point, Dr. Wright. Another component of your business that I've always been very impressed with how you all deal with it is politics, the political side of what you do. Alfred, why don't you address that?
Okay, thank you, Leanne. And we will talk about politics, despite my mother's best advice. And I'm going to start with David Willie. You've been in this business for a while. If it's true that all politics is local, then there's nothing more local than the public school district. So in your district, when you have population changes, geographic changes, the economy changes due to different businesses that move in or move out, when all that happens, the political calculus of your community can change. Also, the needs of the district can change. So what are some of the ways that you have found to address facility needs as your community has changed over the years? David Willie?
Well, let me start with addressing growth. It's probably no accident that the three of us that were invited to participate in this are growing districts, which means we've been selling bonds, which is the topic. So you do have to stay in front of that. It's dangerous to get behind the growth curve. It's always nice right after you've constructed facilities that you're a little bit ahead of the growth curve for a little while. So you got to be sure you do that. And we don't have very much control over growth. It's going to happen if it's going to happen, it's going to happen no matter what we think. But we have to be sure we're analyzing it and looking at it realistically and correctly. And that involves lots of things. One of the most difficult things for all of us is predicting the size of a kindergarten class. And it's really hard to get hold of that data, but you have to, and there's nothing worse than school starting and you having way more kindergarten students than you expected and having to scramble. So that's imperative, that you rely on the data that's there and you analyze it carefully. The other thing about that is the truly political aspect of it. Our community's grown more conservative, as has our state, as has Texas and Tennessee over the years, and as has much of, especially this part of the country. And you can't ignore that. It's the reality. It's the way people view their lives and view what they want out of their tax dollars. The old saw is nobody enjoys paying taxes, and I don't doubt that that's true. But so you have to figure out a way for somebody that is getting less and less willing to pay taxes, that you can convince them that it's something they need to do, particularly with a community or a region or a state that is growing more conservative as time goes on. I don't know whether we've gotten as conservative as we're going to get or not. I doubt it. We'll see. One of these days that'll cycle. I'm sure it always does. But right now we have to make our case in big, bright red letters that you may not like it. You may not want to pay more taxes, but here's what will happen if you don't. And here's what you'll get if you do. And it's just that same old thing. We've all hit on it over and over this afternoon. It's all about communication with your voters. And that's not just because we're asking you to raise your taxes in a month. It's communication about who we are and what we are every day and everybody. That's something maybe hasn't been mentioned. It's not just the superintendent. It's not just the principals. It's not just the central office folks. it's everybody in the district. That classroom teacher of Johnny in the 3rd grade may have more to do with how those parents are going to vote than any of the rest of us do. And so you have to help your staff understand what we're talking about and what their role is. And, sometimes you have to get kind of down to the nitty gritty. Okay, so do you want your air conditioner replaced or not? If you do, you have to help the voters understand that it's their children that are going to benefit from this.
Right. Thank you very much, David. Any of your esteemed colleagues, you have something you'd like to add to that? Well, great. And I'll go on to something that was inspired by the events that unfolded in Texas. And Johnny Hill, you touched on Winter Storm Uri earlier, but it's also relevant in another way because our legislature is in session. And as you mentioned, over 1,000 bills on that very topic. So how have the political ramifications related to the Winter Storm Uri power grid failure influenced the conversations you're having in the district right now?
Well, of course, every time we have a legislative session, all of the cabinet member administrators in our district actually keep up with what's going on. The state of Texas has when the legislators meet once every 2 years, they've got one main goal, and that is to balance the budget. Of course, with this pandemic, obviously our budget is down a little bit. And so with these additional bills as a result of Winter Storm Uri, there's only so much money to go around. So it has really reshaped our conversations because we know the amount of taxes we're able to keep in our schools, as amount of state monies that we get in our schools are going to be very, very limited going into these next 2 years. And so for us, we have reshaped our conversations with how can we get by on less? How can we become more efficient with our operations? We've gone through our budget process. Dr. Wright talked about going through the budget process. We're in the same boat right now. And so we're cutting $6 million out of our budget in anticipation of receiving less monies from our state monies. And so it's basically us having additional conversations and explaining to our staff and our community that we're going to have to do more with less, at least for the next 2 years, and then trying to get buy-in from our community on that.
Oh, thank you, Johnny. And broadly speaking, we have opportunities for there to be governmental and political threats to K-12 education in public finance. And specifically, like in Texas, we have the Texas Teacher Retirement Fund, which is heavily affecting employee benefits. We have the Permanent University Fund and the Permanent School Fund, which heavily influences the way educators have the ability to sell bonds for large capital projects. So how can your decision-making deal with the political aspects of those funds, all heavily invested in the energy sector, and how can that impact what you do, and how does it help you? How does that affect the way you make decisions?
That's a great point. Obviously, we want the very best teachers to come to our state and teach in our schools, because obviously we have the best students in the United States. And I think these other two guys here will say the exact same thing. But we've got to have quality staff. And one way we actually get quality staff is provide them a competitive salary, but also provide them with a competitive retirement. State of Texas legislatively, they invest heavily into the teacher retirement system of Texas. And when there's less monies, then obviously there's a strain on them continuing to put monies or fundings into that bucket. And so every legislative session, we are advocating as much as possible to keep our teacher retirement system of Texas as a defined benefit versus a defined contribution plan. And so we are seems like always trying to advocate for our staff because we want to continue to be able to provide competitive, teachers in our school district, in our school system.
Okay, and thank you very much. And my next question I want to direct to Dr. Donna Wright. Donna, will the national political environment play any role in your school district's public finance consideration over the next few years? And if so, how?
Yeah, I wish I had a magic ball and I could forecast those things, because if anyone that's been, particularly in public education, a number of years, you know how everything becomes cyclical, particularly when you look at, I guess, the political environment. So I really can't say that how that will play out, but I'll go back to what David said earlier as far as the conservatism that we're all experiencing right now. And again, I'm an old economics teacher, so I can sit there and tell you as far as the ebb and flow that even as you look at how things transpire, we can only predict and do the best that we can. But the idea that what we have to make sure that we play out, and sometimes I say that we are victims of our own success. David, Johnny, myself, we have high performing school districts. And with that, you have to keep that bar, that steady, public knowledge out there as far as not only our performance, but the idea that there's a cost that comes with that as well. Whether it's making sure that we're maintaining the most highly effective, highly qualified teachers, to making sure that we are staying ahead of that curve with growth, and making sure that we get that public information out there, that there's a reason why people are moving, gravitating to our area, in spite of the politics, because sometimes, and some of us are saying that, they would, and I've had people say this to me, said, you know what, I wish people wouldn't continue coming and moving into the area. It's getting a little crowded. Okay, well, we can't do anything about that. However, is that the fault of the schools, or do we want to keep, as far as the momentum going, as far as presenting the success of our schools and why they're coming here? So it's one of those double-edged swords. And it comes down to the politics as well, Alfred. I mean, for anyone to say it's not, you're being terribly naive. But what I do know, and what I see, it becomes a sort of a public education perception campaign. And it becomes very critical for all of us, because we know, again, with any cycle, that when you look at an economic downturn, public education is hit hard. And it takes a long time to recover. I mean, I know you know that. We can go back to the recession of 2008. It took a decade for public education to recover and come out of that. And then, and again, we look at those cycles. So, but the politics certainly plays into it. But it's one of those things, it goes back to making sure that there's a public ed perception of what we're doing, how well we're doing, in spite of what others might say. And sometimes it might even be a media campaign, because right now, and we're all facing this, there's a lot of federal dollars that are flowing, a lot. The public doesn't see that might be, as far as the restrictions with that money and how it can be used. They just know that there's enough out there that it might displace, that our taxes are not going to go up. The school system's not going to need additional money. And we have to use that time during this political climate to explain that this is what's we're seeing and experiencing across the country. School systems are a small part of that, but we also have to make sure that it's understood. It doesn't displace your local or your state responsibility, but it's our opportunity, saying that not only are we going to be good stewards, but this is how it's going to be used, so that we don't have to come back. And this might seem very simple, but sometimes you have to explain what non-recurring funds are. I didn't think there would ever be that need, but our ability to be able during this, and I take it back to the political climate, how these dollars will be used, but it does not displace, or the famous school finance term, maintenance of effort. And so with this, we have to be very careful in the next 2 years to make sure that it goes back to telling the story, how it's being used, what we're doing, that return on investment. And it goes back, how well is your child doing? If your child's successful, if your child's happy, I've got a happy family, a happy parent that's going to support us as we go through the hard times. And make no mistake, hard times will be coming.
Well, and Donna, thank you. I really loved your comment about when people would tell you, I wish they would stop moving to my school district, because I used to use that for ammunition against my critics. I'd say, we keep getting more and more students every year. They're not moving into a school district that's terrible. I guarantee you that.
That's right.
Alfred, I would add something to the conversation about national political perspective, and that is interest rates. To the extent that the major political parties have an effect on who the chairman of the Federal Reserve is, or what congressional activities take place that affect the need for the federal government to borrow money. All of that affects interest rates. And we've enjoyed wonderful times recently with unbelievably low rates. But, that has a direct effect on how many bonds you can sell and how much cash you got to come up with every year to make the payment. So that's hugely important. It's not something that we have very much control of or opportunity to influence, but it is hugely important to our ability to finance our capital needs.
Yes, that's definitely very true, David, as well as which bonds get to be sold as tax exempt bonds versus which ones are sold as taxable bonds. Those are also affected. Thank you all very much for those comments on the political landscape. I know Leanne has some topics she'd like to wrap us up with, so I'll turn it over to Leanne.
Thank you, Alfred. This last set of questions can help uncover a bit more of the nuances in K through 12 public finance that will be useful to other professionals involved in these transactions. Based on that, here's a two-part question, and Dr. Wright, I'll start with you. What national trends are you seeing in education that may impact school facilities in the future? And then what is an emerging factor specific to your district that is becoming relevant to its K through 12 public financing?
And I guess, Leigh, I'm going to sort of fall back on, I also teach in higher ed. And so that's one of the things that you also have to, as far as looking at projections, looking at what you see as really trends across the country. And one thing that you don't see it get a lot of, presentation, but it's something, the age of existing facilities across the country. And if anyone looks at that and pays attention to it, you're looking at, in some instances, 80 years. And so there's been a slow cycle of looking and addressing that across the country. I have colleagues that are telling me that, that there's no appetite with taxpayers as long as it's still upright and you're making sure that you've got heat and air, whatever, the building's fine. But there's going to have to be a real focus on looking at those structures across the country, looking at the efficiencies right now, and then the wake-up call that we're all going through right now as far as what this pandemic has brought, as far as looking at not only the aging buildings and the time our children are spending in the length of any time. They're spending more time in some of our school structures than they do in their own homes. So that is a trend that there's a lot of discussion, a lot of conversation, but the big thing is, how are we going to pay for it? How are we going to fund it? So that right there is a big trend. We can also look at some things. Again, I go back to this past year, lessons learned. What have we learned as far as how we provide education, whether it's the structure, whether it's the instruction, what are the long-term ramifications that we need to pay attention to? And again, what we have found this year, and I think Dave could probably affirm this too, time and place become irrelevant. Many of us opened up a virtual school that would run simultaneously to having students in person, but there's still an expense, a cost with that as well, as far as not only, it's more than just the technology, it goes back to infrastructure, having the support personnel. So that's another emerging trend that 5 years ago, we would not, we would talk about one-to-one and the use of technology, but we did not have any idea that we would see the scope or magnitude of moving to a virtual, if not remote world. And it was not just for inclement weather days, but looking at long-term. And also how we can better use our buildings, our existing buildings. There is a lot of discussion right now on how we schedule and work within that. That's a big trend that's coming up. But what we also, going back to lessons learned, there's a need for some costly upgrades. How's it going to be paid for? How are we going to fund it? And with that, how we can more or less get the public to understand as far as the cost, the initial cost compared to what the longer that we put many of these, investments off, how much it's going to cost us in the long run. And again, that goes back to a lot of the conversation that's taking place around the country with existing buildings and where they need to be.
For the last few years, it's been a question on my mind, looking at the trends that I thought I saw as to would we continue to need brick and mortar schools? Would there be a place for a school building 20 or 30 or 40 years from now with where technology appeared to be taking us? Well, I think the lesson every educator in America has learned in the last 12 months is that distance learning, whatever, remote learning, whatever term you choose to use, has its place, but it is not going to be the mainstream. If we weren't going to need to build buildings, we weren't going to need to sell nearly as many bonds. That's just simply enough. I don't think anybody thinks that is our future anymore. I think we've learned that lesson. And I guess, you know, as bizarre as it may be to say this, I guess that was a benefit from the pandemic, is that we did learn that lesson, that we are not getting out of the business of building schools.
Thank you, David. That's a very good point. Now, we've touched on this earlier, but just to give you an opportunity, if you have anything else to share with regard to how your district has benefited from bond refundings. I know, Dr. Wright, you're in the market pretty constantly based on your growth. And David, you shared the fabulous story of actually lowering your millage, which we have enjoyed sharing with many of our other clients, because we just don't hear that very often. But are there any other benefits that you'd like to share?
You know, we've refunded every bond we had in the last 10 years, some of them more than once. And on every time we do one, I tell the board, you know, we'll never see rates like this again.
That's right.
And 2 or 3 months later, they've dropped enough to refund again. It's been unbelievable what's happened. So it's a very, very simple answer. When you can lower that, refund that bond issue, lower that interest rate, and lower that payment, you got money in your pocket for whatever it is you need it for. You've reduced your debt service cost on an annual basis, and you can do other things with that, whether it's sell some second lien bonds for some project, or whether it's raise salaries, whatever your needs are. So there's no such thing as a bad refunding.
And I'll agree with David, even though our situation is much different here. I'll have to commend our county mayor and again, our funding body, because that's something that watching that fluctuation, and particularly with the bond market, and as David said, with the rates right now, I don't know when we will see that kind of real money. And I know just recently our county refinanced existing bonds and made a substantial savings. Again, that, you know, when you look at what was returned back based on their thoughtful and very deliberate intent to refinance those existing bonds. But again, I mean, we all benefit, but something we don't do is make sure that it's public as far as what was done, how it was done. And I guess even educating the public as far as that the bonds being much like a mortgage. You know, a lot of people do not understand how school facilities, big capital projects are financed. And all they can do is look at the school district budget and think that that's it. And that's an operational budget. And I will say that there's been a lot of educating our public to understand that there's 2 buckets there. You've got that operational budget, which tends to be the largest budget in a community. And then you've got the capital plan. And so I'll have to really commend our funding body as well as our mayor that is understood and how they become good stewards at looking at that refinancing.
With regard to what you were speaking of, what large-scale efficiencies or improvements are you seeing in the construction of facilities over the last 5 years? You know, this could be anything from new construction equipment or better skilled personnel to maybe more political harmony or even greater taxpayer willingness. What's your experience?
Well, it's something that we've seen, and particularly this last big construction project that we had to somewhat overcome. People have a vision of what the building should look like based on their own school experience. Now, and that creates a visual. And then when you build these, what I've been told, a behemoth of a high school, they just don't understand why we have to invest that much until they come into the building. And that's something we sometimes fail to do, as far as this is the experience, not only that your child, your grandchildren are taking part in, but again, look at what we're seeing as the outcome of a great instructional, process. And, you think about your environment. And so when we build that, we show that to them. The other thing too is that looking at what is made available, again, it might be the efficiencies, it might be the technology, but the thing is, I go back to what David said, there's nothing that's going to take the place of that brick and mortar building and that teacher in front of a group of students. And so big changes there, big changes. And when you look at the comprehensiveness, whether it's an elementary school or whether it's a high school, and the use of those facilities, but also giving public or community access as well, because it's a community or a public investment. And that's something that's not always been heavily encouraged. And we're doing that, which has really benefited us when people can experience it, particularly those that do not have children in the system anymore. Why should I pay for something? I've raised my children. Well, let me invite you in. You need to see what we're doing. And again, we also have to share that we're looking at investments that are going to be 80 to 100 years in existence if we keep the maintenance and do it well. And that surprises people because they don't think of that in that frame, that the long-term experience that we will have with these buildings, with these facilities. And the thing that we also have to make sure that's understood that we stay ahead of it, because it makes a difference when you're looking at 600 to 800 square feet per classroom, and why there's a need that we need small class size as opposed to putting 30 to 35 to maximize. So there's so much, Leanne, that goes into this that in times past we might not have shared it as well, but we've got to make it a community experience, because there are a lot of people, and it's a growing number across the nation, that do not have children that are in school, and they don't see the need, because as I said, and many times when I go out to speak, that you can determine much about a community by what they do to support the local school system, whether it's looking at their buildings, looking how they present themselves, and then of course, when you look at student performance. But our buildings in this school district do a lot for us, because people comment not only how well maintained they are, but what beautiful buildings they are. So the perception then something good must be going on inside, because that's what the community has invested in our buildings. And it is something to behold. And we're very, very fortunate.
That's wonderful, Dr. Wright. Thank you very much for sharing that. Do you all have any other closing comments you'd like to make, or anything you'd like to share?
Well, I'll add one thing, and it has to do with building design, kind of what Donna was just talking about. We want our buildings to have a wow factor. You can build a really nice building, and if somebody walks in and says, this is a really nice building, or they can walk in and go, wow. So we want that wow factor so that people understand that we're doing everything we know to do for their children. And wow factor covers a lot of territory. It could be the technology you have, it could be the equipment you have, it could be the paint scheme. All of that goes into the wow factor. In my experience, the wow factor costs about 5% more than non-wow factor. And it's not a big deal to have a wow factor. And it's doing a bunch of little things that are not very expensive. Anytime we get ready to build anything, we go tour. We ask around who's built this recently. We go look at several. Mm-hmm. We're not too proud to steal anybody's good ideas. And so you do that and you find this is good here, this is good here, this is good here, because everybody's got some good ones. And you put all those together and you spend that 5% more, and you've got that wow factor. Well, that pays off in terms of public support, as Donna was talking about, but it also pays off in terms of quality of education. Students and staff like to be in a place that has a wow factor. That's just human nature. And so that's something, does it cost a little bit of money? Yeah, it does, but it's money well spent and well invested. So you just have to put that into your plan when you're developing a building program and what it's going to cost and how you're going to pay for it.
And David, what does it add to it as far as when you look at property values and in and around the community as well?
Sure.
And that's something that when someone says, I don't want a high school in my backyard, I don't want to look at those Friday night lights, and my property values go down, I've never seen that happen.
Like back to your point, Donna, about getting people in the building. We have a lot of people that never have a reason to come in our building. Their children are out of school, or they don't have children, or they're not children, they don't have children yet. So they draw their conclusion about what's going on inside that building from what they see when they drive by, because that's all they know. So we spend a lot of time and effort on being sure what they see when they drive by leaves a good impression. And that's everything from shrubs and flowers to sidewalks swept. It's a bunch of little things, but it has a big dividend and makes a big difference if you tend to it.
I'd like to thank all of you for being with us today. It's so interesting to see the similarities between the states, but also the specific differences. What a thought-provoking conversation. Thank you all again for sharing your perspectives. This concludes our introductory topic, a national perspective on funding K-12 education capital projects, a Stevens Public Finance webinar panel in collaboration with David Woolley of the Alma School District in Arkansas, Johnny Hill of the Allen Independent School District in Texas, and Dr. Donna Wright of the Wilson County School System in Tennessee.
Be sure to follow future installments of our virtual thought leadership series online. But for now, I'm Alfred Ray.
And I'm Leigh Biernat. Join us next time as we capitalize on independence. Have a great day.
For more insights from Stevens Public Finance or to learn more about working with us, please visit stevens.com or contact Stevens Inc. at stevens.com.